Hey guys, I am hanging out in Darnassus. Good old Darnassus. This was never a very populated city back when being in capital cities seemed to really matter, and it's quite deserted now. And it's a symbolically very appropriate place for me to talk about a couple things. This city is pretty much empty. There's a couple players here and there. Most of them low level night elf there. Not too many other people as far as 100s, level 100 characters or anything like that goes. It's empty. And it's appropriate because this game is in many ways empty. It's full of people. You see people everywhere. You see other players all the time. But there's very little reason to interact with those players. There's not a lot of reason to be in a city and talk to people here. If you look at trade chat, I don't know if you can see here, it's all ads and people wanting to recruit for their raiding guilds. So those are the two things that are going on, is bots and let's raid. And that's pretty much what's going on in the game right now. You can experience raid content in one of the 4 difficulties that are available now: Mythic, Heroic, Flex, or Raid Finder. You can do awful Apexis dailies by yourself because other people don't really want to group up with you. You can PvP with different people every night. The game is in many ways socially empty, and it wasn't always this way. It's become this way because of a bunch of little changes that end up adding to one big change in the feeling of the game. Once upon a time, this game had more player interaction, and there were a couple things that caused that player interaction to emerge. The emergent behavior of players was created by seemingly innocuous design decisions early in the game. So when you first started playing this game, the quest content was actually rather challenging. You couldn't really do very much by yourself. You really needed the help of other people. Just to kill regular mobs sometimes, especially if you were a class that was weak early in the game, like Priest or Druid or something like that. It was really helpful to have other people just to do the regular quests out in the world, out in like the Barrens or in Westfall. Having a group really helped. Like trying to get through the Moonbrook mobs that would who could spell crit you and one-shot you. It was really, really hard without at least like one other person helping you. So that sort of design of the game is difficult and is designed to be played with more than one person at a time caused you to interact with people. You met other people, and you ended up playing with them and grouping with them and adding them to your friends list and playing with them in dungeons. So once you got to dungeons, you had to find 5 people. You had to go out in the world and apply your friends list. You had to search trade chat or search looking for group or search the zone early on in vanilla to find the group, and you had to be selective with your group. You had to pick people who weren't jerks and weren't going to roll on gear they didn't need. You had to pick people that knew how to play their class. And all of that enforced a certain social climate that I think was very, very friendly. If somebody didn't really know how to play, before you would kick them out of a group, you would teach them how to play their class, especially if you were leveling up. So nowadays, you would probably just boot somebody that wasn't doing well. You wouldn't try to correct what they were doing, even if you were leveling up. And you certainly wouldn't add somebody to your friends list who was new at the game and kind of help them along. You wouldn't put in any effort to make somebody better at the game. You wouldn't recruit players that were lower level than you to eventually be in your guild, because everybody has to level up by themselves nowadays to sort of get their feet on the ground. There's not a lot of help leveling because you needed help leveling early on. Eventually, that experience went up into the higher 50s and up into level 60 in vanilla, and you needed bigger groups. You needed 10-man groups. Before there was Molten Core, you needed 10 to 15-man groups. That started to persuade people to not only have more people on their friends list, but create things like guilds, where it would be easier to form groups. It'd be easier to have a reliable core of people to do things with you. And as Molten Core was released, it further changed that. You started to have a big guild. And then the social aspect really had to be there to serve the gaming aspects. In order to field a 40-man raid, you had to have a really big guild. It had to be more than 40 people, because you weren't going to have everybody show up every night. You were going to have some people who didn't show up one of your raid nights. You'd have to have alternates come in. You'd probably have some low-level people to replace those who quit due to attrition or just boredom with the game or having other things going on. So you end up with sort of a really big guild structure. You had class. You might have had class leaders. We had class leaders at level 60, so you'd have 8 to 10 to sometimes 15 of a single class in your guild, and you'd have a class leader that would basically teach people how to play that class, decide what specs were people going to be, and not everyone would be the same spec because you would want different talents for raid buffs and things. A lot of people call that the corporate raid structure, and I don't really like that term, but it makes sense. The guild became organized around doing large-scale content, doing 40-man content. Molten Core, Blackwing Lair, AQ40, and Naxxramas were all 40 people, and they not only required 40 people, they required 40 people with gear. So you had to help those people get the gear to get into the initial raids, and you also had to have a guild that would decide how gear would be distributed. Because in Molten Core, there were 40 people in the raid. There's 16 slots for each person, and there would be two items that would drop per boss, with all those slots having to be filled in Molten Core. People were hungry to get their epics, and you had to design systems like DKP systems to decide that. So it was very corporate in a sense. But along with that came a real strong sense of community, both within your guild and without your guild, or outside of your guild. So within your guild, you had to be very, very professional and kind to people, because that could get you kicked out of the guild. You didn't want to create conflicts. Certainly if you were an officer, you didn't want people in your guild to be having conflicts with each other. You wanted them resolved because you wanted the raid to go smoothly. So you would end up removing people that didn't get along with one another or refused to get along with one another. Outside of your guild, you also wanted to be professional because you relied on other people to get into groups. If you ran a raid in Molten Core and you ninja'd Domo's chest, which was a real thing, people did it. You didn't have to be, that was back before there was Master Looter that could loot the chest. You would never, you could possibly never get into a pug on that server again. You could never get into another pickup group. So maintaining friendships, creating friendships, all of that was created by the game content being challenging and requiring you to group up. Over time that changed. The raids dropped from 40 people down to 25 people. And I remember being very excited about that because we thought we didn't have to field 40 raiders. We're like, 40 raiders is really hard. Well, turns out it was just as hard to field 25 because the size of guilds shrank by that much more. Guilds shrank down to whatever size the primary raid happened to be. So 25 in Burning Crusade, guilds were a little bit bigger than 25. They were maybe 35 people. But you wouldn't invite more than that because the point of the guild was to accomplish the raid. It wasn't to do large-scale things like it was in vanilla. Everybody had already leveled up. And then you also had this thing where guilds would snipe members. They would steal members from other guilds because that was the only way that you could account for attrition and still have people with high enough items, with good enough gear to do the harder raids like Black Temple and Sunwell. So that sort of changed that whole social atmosphere. Because people were leveling even further, you didn't necessarily invite levelers to your guild. You didn't account for attrition. There wasn't quite as much out in the world interaction, but there was still a lot of recruitment for guilds. Guilds were still necessary. In Wrath of the Lich King, they changed content so it could be done in 10-man mode or 25-man mode, and that made a lot of guilds, smaller guilds, happy because they didn't want to be big guilds. And I understand that. I was in a smaller guild in Wrath of the Lich King for the second half, and I was in a bigger guild for the first half. So for the second half, I actually probably had a better time than the first half, even though I wasn't doing quite as much hard mode content. It wasn't quite as serious. I think I had more fun because it was a tighter social core group of people. But at the same time, that also encouraged guilds to get even smaller. If all you wanted to do was see the content, there was no real reason to go into a competitive 25-man guild. You could do just as well in a 10-man guild. It gave you items of a lower quality in Wrath of the Lich King, but you could do the next 10-man raid with those items. So as long as you were happy doing the 10-man track, they could sort of slightly... People thought it was more casual, but the encounters could, in some cases, be more difficult. I remember in particular 10-man Algalon being very difficult. But as long as you were happy staying on the 10-man track, you were fine. So we had a lot more small guilds and a lot less big ones. The big guilds started to really kind of die out. After that, 10 and 25-man dungeons dropped the same loot. You just got more of the same in a 25-man. So the only reason to run a 25-man raid was to gear out slightly faster. The problem was between patch updates, there's plenty of time to get all the gear that you need. So almost all the big 25-man guilds started to die away, and people were really doing 10-mans way more than 25-mans. 10-mans in Cataclysm, if I remember correctly, were much more common than 25-mans. Doing 25-mans was almost unheard of. For most guilds, at least. A lot of them just wanted to do 10-mans. People were happy to do 10-mans. There were still 25-man guilds out there, but they're, again, starting to get less and less common. I didn't really play in Mists of Pandaria because I was living in 2 cities at the time, so that's an expansion I don't have a lot of experience with. But I can speak to Warlords of Draenor. In Warlords of Draenor, we have 4 different raid levels. There's Raid Finder, which I believe came out at the end of Cataclysm. I believe it came out at the end of Cataclysm. And that's another one that removed the social necessity. Now you could auto-queue for raids. At the end of Wrath of the Lich King, you could auto-queue for dungeons. That was 5-man content, so that did eliminate a little bit the necessity for you to have people in your guild to run 5-mans with, because you could just auto-queue in with strangers. But it didn't totally eliminate the need for guilds, because you still needed a guild to run raids. At the end of Cataclysm, you no longer needed to organize a guild to run raids, because you could do Raid Finder. If you were a casual player, there was no reason to be in any kind of, to push yourself to be in any kind of guild with people that you didn't know. You could just do Raid Finder, and you got the same loot, again, a little lower item level, but it was very easy. Very easy to do, wasn't a big challenge. You could see all the content you needed to, and you could be happy with that and not have to feel like you had to do heroic mode. In Pandaria, I believe they had flex, and then they had, set raids. So there were some 25-man guilds. There's always going to be some larger guilds. But now in Warlords, you have the same thing. You have Raid Finder, which anyone can auto-queue into, and you can auto-queue into your dungeons, and you can auto-queue into all your PvP stuff. So everything's auto-queued. You have Flex, which are normal raids, which will sort of adjust their content to whoever you bring. And I actually think that's a pretty cool feature. Lets you bring whatever number of people you like to out of your guild, and it will sort of adjust the content from there. I think that's fine. But the trade-off is that you no longer need a set guild size. You no longer have to build up a large guild. You can still keep a small guild. So it's mostly, I think the trade-off's mostly on the positive for that. The problem is that you can do the content on Raid Finder in normal difficulty and not feel like you've missed anything over heroic and mythic difficulty. So mythic was set, I'm trying to remember what number they set it at. I believe it's 20 men. For some reason I don't remember off the top of my head. So you can do that. So there are raids that are dedicated to mythic raiding. But for everybody else that's not doing mythic raiding, that's just seeing the content normally, there's no motivation to go out and be in a guild. So what we've seen happen is we've seen guilds die. We've seen these emergent social organizations that had websites and charters and all the things that we had in our guild that were totally outside the game, but were built around the concepts that were in the game in order to accomplish things in the game. All that's kind of gone. So what we're left with is a Darnassus of a game. There's a couple people that we can interact with, but it's mostly empty. It's mostly devoid of the sort of emergent aspects that made the game really fun and engrossing socially all those years ago. And it's compounded by the garrison. I've made another video talking about how the garrison locks you away from everybody. So you no longer even see people on your screen, much less have to interact with them. And that's very true of the garrison. Other things, other design elements that have changed the way the game is over the years, in addition to the social part, are flying mounts. Flying mounts really let you fly over the content. I no longer have to interact with Darnassus. I can just fly away from it. I can just fly up above it and see it. It's much less grand from above. There's only like a couple of buildings. It doesn't look nearly as cool as when you're on the ground. So your perspective on the content changes, and also you're able to fly over hostile monsters and just drop down to kill the one that you want to kill. That's changed game design tremendously to make it much easier to avoid the world part of the World of Warcraft. There really is no world in World of Warcraft. In turn, they've made the world less interactive, less dangerous. Even in Warlords of Draenor, where they didn't have flying, they kind of caved and said they were going to give people flying. And in the latest zone they came out with, there's virtually no interactivity with the environment. It's just a bunch of grind quests with bars that fill up as you grind in a couple of select spots. And the large-scale collection quests, there's not any lore. It's very, very sad compared to even these early starting zones that would be full of full of great quests with text, then would teach you lore and things like that. So that's another part, is the design is shied away from having you read and interact with the world to experience lore to sort of giving you with cutscenes. I think the main one is all that social stuff that I've talked about. That has really changed the player base. People are now really used to auto queues. You can't really get rid of it. And people are very toxic socially. They have no reason to be nice in a group. They'll be a jerk in a group, every group. If you go into Asheron, you're going to see spam in the chat of everyone calling each other douchebag and faggot over and over again, because there's no consequence to doing that. Once upon a time, if you started calling everybody a bunch of slurs and saying a bunch of homophobic stuff, you would end up getting kicked out of the group. You'd get kicked out of the raid and you wouldn't get invited back. People would know you as a jerk, and that could have a big influence on what you did, especially on smaller and medium-sized servers. That was definitely the case. Even on large servers, reputation mattered quite a bit. So all of that stuff has ended up impacting, same thing with Raid Finder, has ended up impacting the population, so it's way more toxic now than it used to be. And it's really not fun to interact with those people. I don't really want to interact with them. I want interaction with players, but not with the players that are in the game, because they're all jerks, right? They're calling everybody racial slurs and homophobic slurs all the time, and calling everybody an idiot if they say one thing wrong. Like, I remember I was in an Asheron, and this is right after the patch hit. I don't read every single word of the patch notes. We killed the boss, and I didn't get a box, and I said, I said, this buggy crap, it didn't give me a box, and somebody started calling me an idiot and a faggot because I didn't know that they didn't drop that in the patch, which had dropped 2 days before, that they don't drop boxes anymore. And that's just an example of the sort of toxic community that has developed in World of Warcraft as a result of the lack of social organization that's happened. So I'd probably say all those things kind of adding up has really hurt the game. Flying is another design decision that I'm not too keen on. Auto queuing is the big one that I think has hurt hurt most things. Otherwise, like the other design decisions, class mechanics, I mean, those are all trade-offs. Everything's a trade-off. Auto queuing's a trade-off. It's beneficial for some people because you get in the group faster, but it makes content easier. You have to design content easier because everybody wants to use auto queues, and it also makes the community really toxic. So I just thought I'd talk about some of those things. Just sort of how the emergent gameplay, the emergent social organization that made this game really, really, to me, very attractive. I loved guilds and I liked big organizations of people. I liked interacting with people that were in that organization. I loved running a guild, sort of. There were good and bad things. I loved being in a big guild with lots of people that could teach me how to play and who I could teach how to play. I had a great time with the social organization in Vanilla and Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King. But since then, I felt like the game is a lot less approachable socially, probably especially unapproachable if you're a new player.
Oh.
I don't know for sure because I haven't talked to too many new players about this sort of thing, but I imagine it's quite difficult to approach guilds and things like that if you are not a veteran player. And if you are a veteran player, it's really difficult to find. You have to actively go out and find guilds that want to be guilds to do content. You don't really need to be in the guild to do content, and that's kind of unfortunate. That means the content's no longer designed with that long-term, large-scale goals in mind. But anyway, thanks for watching. Those are just some things I thought I'd talk about. This is one of the things that I think I will probably either be playing very little WoW and will be focused on one element. It'll probably be raiding if I can manage it, just because I feel like the raiding content is always fresh and interesting. They still do a good job with it, for what I've seen of the new Hellfire Citadel and that sort of stuff. Oh, there's a horde down there. But I probably won't PvP. I might PvP. PvP is something I can do on my downtime, but I'll probably be trying to play a different game. I've been playing Elder Scrolls Online recently, and I've had a really, really good time playing it. And it's hard to find those good experiences anymore in WoW, which is very unfortunate. So anyway, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. This should be on my gaming channel, so subscribe if you like. You can find me on twitch.tv/DavidVStewart if you want to watch streams. I'm usually streaming in the afternoon, but I've got a kid on the way, so things may be a little more crazy for that. And have a good one.